Hi, I'm Ginna Gordon, instigator and host of the Arts and Letters series, where we discuss words, the arts, ideas with mostly local authors and artists. Welcome to Arts and Letters. As the Art Presence board member in charge of all things books and local authors, I am really excited to add to the Arts and Letters Zoom series a few conversations about the art of memoir. Our community is lucky to have many artists and writers telling their stories and sharing their art. On July 9th, Christin and I will talk about the word memory itself, how we remember, what we remember, and how our memory changes. My favorite quote about the subject of memoirs is from author Anne Lamott. She says, "Write your story. If people didn't want you to write about them, they should have behaved better." Tonight, we begin a conversation about the art of writing memoirs. Christin Weber is with me. Good evening, Christin, and thanks for being my memoir conversation partner. Hi, Christin.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi there.
I'm going to keep Christin here with me, but I am going to share a few thoughts before I open the floor to her to talk about her view of memoirs and a little bit about her process. What is a memoir? What is the difference between a memoir and an autobiography? Let's begin with autobiography. The Oxford Dictionary describes it as an account of a person's life written by that person. That's it in a nutshell. In my words, it's an I was born, we did this, and then we did that story. It's a chronicle of the life. Here's an example. This is an autobiography called A Lucky Life. We produced this in 2016 for an author in Carmel Valley. Ken wrote this in his 80s and 90s in Carmel Valley. It is 100,000 word chronological account of all his days, from childhood in England to a life of service in the Navy, and then a colorful career as a steward on board several ocean liners. He retired in Carmel Valley after a third career as a high school English teacher. It covers his own teachers from grade school through high school, his favorite foods, his children, his first and second wives, etc. It is very detailed. There is a formal timeline, a family tree, and photos of Ken from the crib to retirement. Here are the first two paragraphs from Ken's preface. When attempting to remember episodes or periods or one's words and actions and exchange between individuals, the mind wants to recall particular people who were important in the past. It is like looking at old photographs and notebooks. Time has faded the image and the words. At my 89th year today, I pieced together what once was one day following the next, which became a week, and then a month, and even eventually a year, and became my life in dates and times. Of course, happy and tragic times and momentous incidents are available in the memory and are indelible in the memory, like an echo or an image. I hope I have recalled friends and those who loved me, and especially the angels who appeared, perhaps fleetingly, or were pivotal in some way to solve an impasse or open a door I thought was shut. That to me is a true autobiography. A memoir, according to Oxford, is any nonfiction narrative writing based on the author's personal memories. To me, when someone says something like something is based on memories, it is less a description of a then we did this and then we did that, as it is a story often with a theme or a moral. It might describe a moment in time during which the author learned something, or changed, or grew up. Here are my examples of memoirs with a theme. They happen to be written by me. They are basically about the love of cooking. My first cookbook, which I'm not showing you tonight, was a simple celebration, which I wrote for the Chopra Center for Wellbeing in San Diego in 1997. It is a cookbook about the Ayurvedic lifestyle written for Westerners using Western ingredients. It was a fun book to write, and I learned a lot but I never felt like it was my book. It was their book about the program, using my recipes and my research about Ayurveda in the kitchen. I longed to write my own cookbook based on my notes from 30 years in the business of feeding people. I started by organizing the myriad boxes of memorabilia that I carried around all those years. I sorted through all and wound up with 15 banker's boxes, categorized by decade. Some decades took up 2 boxes. In those boxes are reams of mini legal pad notes about ingredients, recipes, and alterations. Scribbles on cocktail napkins while I furtively parse the ingredients of somebody else's salad dressing in a restaurant. Pages out of Gourmet and Bon Appetit magazines, pictures of me with myriad other chefs and staffs, menus, dreams, and ideas. A lot of pictures of food, from piles of fresh ingredients to platters of delicious meals. While in this process, my imaginary muse tapped me on the shoulder and whispered, "Don't forget your mother's binders." I dug those out of a storage box, 12 red leather binders embossed with my mother's name and the food categories such as bread, baked goods, and desserts, or meat, poultry, and fish. These binders were a gift to her from her father in the same year we, my mother, brother, and I, moved back to Bonnybrook Farm while my father went off to Korea in 1951. I'm telling you this for a reason. This is how a memoir begins. I laid out all my mother's binders on the kitchen table. As I flipped through the binders, I found and remembered all the foods from my childhood: fresh baked bread and cinnamon rolls, soups and stocks, the original Green Goddess dressing. I also found remnants of 50s cooking, like white sauce made with Campbell's cream of mushroom soup, or dressings made from Durkee's famous sauce. I wonder if anybody else remembers Durkee's famous sauce. You'll have to send me a note and let me know. But mostly I found all these gems worth remembering and sharing to save for my childhood, for my children, if they're interested. And I remembered that cold winter at Bonnybrook Farm. I was thinking about making up a story about my mother's cooking and the life on my grandfather's gentleman's farm in Ohio. Then the amuse arrived again. This time her voice was louder. She grabbed me by the collar and practically dragged me down the hall to a closet, pointed at a shoebox wound up with black electrical tape. The muse, shouting in my ear now, said, "You don't have to make anything up. It's all here." And so I opened the box, which contained my parents' love letters of that very year we were on the farm, 1951. Letters I deemed too private to read in the 25 years since my parents' deaths. I spread them out on the table, and I read them. Wow. And that is how Honey Baby Darlin', the Cookbook Series, began with Bonnybrook about that year. Here's the first few paragraphs from the Bonnybrook preface. In the fire-warmed kitchen of Bonnybrook, Flossie and Bessie provided an abundant table and oversaw the keeping of the big house. Lincoln managed the garden and the coop. Backstairs, above the kitchen wing, their rooms were at the top of wide, glossy white steps, which climbed around the west end of the kitchen. At the east, in the foyer, rose a curving staircase with mahogany banister, excessively carved and polished to a dark gleam, down which I actually did slide once. It did not end well. My favorite quote from that era is a letter from my mother to my father that says, "Little Ginna Bell," I was 3, "is fine. 3 square meals a day and a couple of cookies, and she's a happy girl." It takes bravery to write a memoir, digging deep into the good and the bad, the right and the wrong, the epiphanies. I chose to write about food because it has been and is a major part of my life, beginning with Virginia's devotion to the kitchen in the 50s. And the thread that weaves it all together are those letters between 2 people in love, separated by war and oceans. Then my scope broadened for the gingerbread farm, which is based on 20 years in Carmel Valley on my own little farm, where I grew veggies and I cooked and I fed myriad bohemian neighbors in the 60s and the 70s. And I developed my first business, Ginna and Company Catering. Again, those banker's boxes came in handy. I immersed myself in those boxes for material. Both books have about 150 recipes, lots of pictures and stories about the love of cooking, honed over years of experience. Here is a letter from my father to my mother on their anniversary in 1959, the day that the gingerbread farm begins. June 1959. My own. I always have the feeling that something extraordinary should happen on our anniversaries, some planetary event. I watch for bursting rockets or shooting stars, winged angels flying out of fluffy white cakes, because I am sure the heavens are as glad as I am that we are married. But tomorrow, nothing unusual like that will happen, and it is just as well. What will happen is much more desirable. You will smile at me. I'll wake up in the morning and you will be beside me, and you would do that for no one but me in this world. Ginna and Mark will knock on the door for homework help, new ribbons, shoe polish, any minute, the car keys. Jess will wiggle his way under the covers for a snuggle, and soon enough, the car keys. The fact that such things happen every day is what makes life so sublime. You are so fine, so decent, so pleasant, mornings before coffee the exception, so loving and lovable. I respect you for your intelligence, your ideals, your principles, your integrity. You are all that matters, and I have the privilege of making you happy. Your fortunate husband. The third cooking memoir, The Guru Years, is based on the next 15 years of my cooking career, which took me all over California preparing food for teachers, gurus, and retreat centers. It's unfinished. Novels get in the way, and another subject altogether. The Guru Years will emerge sometime, maybe, in 2022. Although they are chronological, my stories are less about the order and more about learning and growing as a cook and as a nurturer. Memories of different eras, food choices, and growth as a cook. And a love story. So, Christin, will you come back, talk to me now, and all of us about your experiences with the art of writing memoirs.
Ginna, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to share this time with you. And thank all of the rest of you for coming to experience this about memoirs. I wrote my first memoir when I was 17 years old, and it was basically the story of my relationship with my high school sweetheart. And he had gone off to the Air Force, and I was about to go off to the convent, and the priest said to me, "You can't be writing to a young man who's in the Air Force if you're going off to the convent." And so I talked with him, and I begged, and finally he gave in that I could write one more letter. So I wrote one more letter, and it was the whole story of my relationship with this young man who was now in the Air Force. And I've been writing stories ever since, and memoirs ever since. I have like 4 initial lessons that I've learned from actually doing the writing over all of this time. And that's what I would like to talk a little bit about tonight, are these 4 keys that I use when I'm working on a memoir. The first one came from my mother, who was also a writer. She always wanted to write a memoir. She never did. She was too busy doing other things and writing other things. She wrote for the local newspaper. And her first lesson to me was write in your own voice. And I'd like to read to you out of this memoir that I wrote about my mother, my convent sisters, and myself. And her lesson has to do with having words in her fingers. That's the way she put it, for having her own voice. After she died in 1993, I put my letters from Mama in plastic page savers, organized them by date, and stored them in a black loose-leaf notebook. It's here, by my chair, on the bottom shelf of the bookcase. If I begin to read a letter, my mind calls up her voice. I don't do so often, not because I don't want to hear her, but because I do. And the pluck of her words upon my heart vibrates a chord that is never severed. The words are in my fingers, my mother used to say, and her words collapse time. Instinct warns me that by following the trail of her words, I will walk the path not only of her life, but of my own, especially of the path I took in and out of a Catholic convent. Do I even want to make that journey? Does it matter what I want? Must I follow it regardless? The word is where the dance is. Maybe if I follow her, we can dance together upon this trail. I must remember that and fear neither her voice nor mine, despite the carefully hidden truths those voices can uncover and reveal. This reminds me, Ginna, of the quote that you read by Annie Lamott. That is so good and so true. And it's that worry that stops me the most often, like, what are other people, is this going to hurt them? And she just takes care of that, just like that. Now, some people never write their memoirs because they don't consider themselves writers. And I think that is where this rule about using your own voice comes in, because people have this massive variety in the way that we take in and structure and remember our experience. Reproducing a memory has equal variety. We speak it, we dance it, we draw it, we paint it, we write it. In all of these, but for me, most especially in writing, we have to go way down into our memories, to the source of what we are, so that the words come from something in us more fundamental than our minds, so deep that, in my mother's metaphor, they seem to arrive on the page directly from our fingers. A most recent experience of having words come from my fingers is happened to me just last week in the latest memoir that I'm writing. And this is the first draft. This is hot off the fingers. In March of 2002, the phone rang, and my sister's voice on the other end was trembling. "I need you," she said. "Can you come?" Once again, I stepped out into that space, that nowhere between worlds. Instantly, shorter than an intake of breath had happened. The choice had been made years ago, The first time I saw my sister in her bassinet coming home from the hospital in Warroad, Minnesota, where she had been born. Dad and Mama in the front seat of the car, she and I in the back. "You take care of your little sister," Mama said. And there it was, the choice, gladly, eagerly, jealously almost. Now she was dying. I would go to her. Nothing could stop me. I would go to her, and John would stay home to take care of our little dog, Momo. One doesn't even ask the questions that cannot be answered. How long? What if? I would go, and he would stay. He and I had gone together the day after our wedding, less than a year before. I would go alone this time. Who could tell what I might need to do? How love might occupy my time, my focus. He would stay. I would go. So the words in the fingers, using your own voice. Second, when you're writing, it's really important to be writing something you can't help but write. Natalie Goldberg says in her book, Writing Down the Bones, go for the jugular. It's really hard to do. It's scary. But there's an urgency in this. That means the experience you remember has power and it feels complex. How can you ever put it together in a way that makes sense to anyone else? Maybe it doesn't even make sense to you, but it was so powerful when it happened that you were changed by it, or you felt that if you wrote it, you could die. Maybe you could go to hell, or others would be changed, or they might be angry, or would suffer and die, or life itself, pretty grandiose, life itself would be changed. But what if we need to dare all this because there is an event or a person that had that kind of impact? And you must find the words that are strong enough and beautiful enough, or even devastating enough, to reconstruct that memory that changed your life. That same young man who went off to the Air Force when I went off to the convent showed up again, not really, but in my mind, in the convent, very soon after I entered. And this is from the book. It's his memoir. It's a memoir of John Weber. And in the convent, the novice mistress was going to take me to task for his presence in my mind. The convent incinerator room smelled of fire and waste. The sisters crushed cans underfoot, dumped them into barrels quickly, holding their breath. Whatever could not nourish or no longer had a use found its way into the fire. Bones from the slaughtered sheep, feathers from plucked hens, remains of our long hair, sheared to the scalp on a day called Reception of the Veil. Mother Ann, the novice mistress, sent me to the incinerator room to think. After sacrificing your home, your parents, your children, the ones you might have had, and especially the love of this young man, would you allow his picture to come between you and your divine spouse? Go to the incinerator room and ponder the fires of hell. I had confessed to hiding his picture, in a corner of my trunk. Who will you choose? The old nun's round, wire-rimmed glasses magnified her eyes. Jesus or the picture of that boy? How many other women had stood where I stood, holding the treasure they could not let go? Did they lift the door to the fire and see hell? Or did they see those embers at the bottom, light glowing through the waste, galled and gashed as the poet sighed, gold vermilion? A divided heart will break. I held his picture in my hand and stood half an hour thinking of snow, of 3 pines reflected in Wabanica Creek, of morning rising over the lake, of the velvet upholstery in his 1938 Plymouth coupe, of the door closing, of opening the door, of my feet running after him, of his arms, of goodbye, 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 of the sound the Plymouth made driving away, of my steamer trunk filled with memory and desire, of promises. A divided heart is already broken. I let go. John's picture fell into the fire. The memory that one puts into a memoir, it must haunt you. It's required almost that it haunt you. It must be a question or a mystery that you have not yet answered or solved. This is another aspect of the buildup of energy that is needed to complete a writing project. Something beyond what I know or am aware must be pulling on me. It wakes me at night. It seeps into my dreams. It might be a line from a song that won't go away. It doesn't matter what your topic is, your mother's one-of-a-kind recipes, or the anticipated death of your spouse. The story is best if the writer is compelled to figure something out. When I married John Sack, my third husband, and also a writer, he suggested I write a trilogy called My Last John. Or I thought 3 husbands might be better. The biggest mystery lay at the feet of my first husband, the Catholic priest, Patrick Kelly. It's a memoir entitled The Root of Beauty. The line from the Lara poems. Can you see it? Yeah. The heroic life is the root of beauty. It draws together you and me. Well, as it turned out, it drew us into paradox. Of all my memoirs, the one about Pat Kelly is the most haunted and the most haunting. I keep hoping that when I'm finally finished with the trilogy of memoirs, I'll have discovered what all that haunting was for. He died, Pat did, at 55, long before I could figure it out. The haunting fell right into the crater of his death. Eventually, I would need to face the whole of my life, and memoir writing would become a necessity. This is from The Root of Beauty, and it's from a period, the part right before he died. We already knew he was dying, but we'd only known that for like 2 weeks. Fear can liquefy our bones. We go to set down a foot, and the ground has disappeared. A hand trembles, and the coffee splashes from the cup. All of this transpired between Easter and Pentecost, which we celebrated with the Poor Clare nuns in Ridgefield. I'd been blessed with good friends there, and they circled us with their loving calm. On Pentecost, one of them took a picture of Pat and me with Sister Bernadette. I look at the picture now, and I wonder how it had not confirmed the prophecy in my dreams of his death. I see it there now. Death, a dark and terrible beauty, softening the recesses of his eyes. And then a thought from that about memory itself, which we'll be talking about in July. Memory is deceptive. It bears only the faintest resemblance to what we call the facts, the actual happenings, the external details. Life, for all our attempts to capture it for exactly what it is or was, passes through our awareness in a dreamlike manner. Memory is a magnet drawing together what was actual with what we hoped would be real, repulsing what we feared and what we refused to accept. The choices made as we attempt to sort out memory's accretions identify each of us and form the content of our story here in this earthly existence. Our reality, though, is the deep ocean made up of everything, alive with all we do not remember, influencing our every breath and heartbeat, affecting our health or lack of it, concealing, if we dared to look, the very face of God. Finally, the key is to stare at what you've written until you see the connections from the beginning to the end. Amazed in the beginning, anchored in the middle, coming round again at the end to finally understand. It can help to look at memory through the eyes of yourself as a child. And while I was writing these other books, I also had an internet blog called Mary Jane of the Lorelands. These episodes that are now in this book somehow contributed to the other books that I was writing, and I began to see those themes going through these episodes. There's a spiral-like scene in this book towards the end, returning to my grandmother's resort on Lake of the Woods, the first 8 years of my life, the location of the other stories in the book. On my return there in my 30s, I took Pat Kelly with me. I wanted him to see how my life began as a child. On a day in the early 1980s, Pat Kelly and I visited what was left of the old Klimak's Lodge. Not much. The lodge itself had been torn apart, sections of it moved and turned into cabins, much of it just tossed out as trash. Pat and I wandered an unfamiliar landscape. I think this is where the ice house used to be. And there once were beautiful rocks down there on the shore. One was like crystal, and Mary Jane, that was my name when I was a child, and Mary Jane would pretend to be inside it, following the fissures like roads into the interior. We walked toward the woods where Grandma Klimak's daisies used to grow, the big tree where Mary Jane's swing hung. Gone. Where was the spot she buried that baby chick? Where did she dance around the grave of Sparky the dog? The earth had reconfigured itself. Is this also what becomes of us? the individuals who occupy a space? Are we as ephemeral as the land we once thought to be secure? So stable and steady that even if everything else changed, the land would remain. And then it doesn't. There is something more here than one stunning notion that we can't go home again. Better is T.S. Eliot's insight that we can go home again, but only after long explorations and then in the keen sight of a life intensely lived, we can finally know the place, the essence of the soul, for the first time. We walked the forest's edge. Maybe it was the wrong time of year for wildflowers. Leaf green and deep red of sumac curtained the interior. Pat was pointing. Look, look, a spot of red almost hidden in the long grass. Too round to be a sumac leaf. What? I went towards it. Whether it had survived or returned there every time a spirit of innocence ran laughing at the forest's edge really didn't matter. Whether it had belonged to Mary Jane, a true archaeological find, or to a succession of individual children over the years, these details rarely matter to the heart. I laughed, feeling I'd found a bit of her, a round of color in a shaft of summer sun, a child's red ball. So, Ginna, that's it.
I have a question for you, Christin. You are a very prolific writer. Do you find that you write, do you have many different themes, or do you have a theme that seems to keep showing up and that you write about over and over in different stories? Or what is the thread of your themes, your various themes of your, how many, 5 memoirs that you've written now?
5 memoirs. In the memoirs, the thread is paradox, I think. It's starting off in one direction and ending up someplace else. There's a big theme of loss in my memoirs because that's been a big theme of my life. There's also a big theme of love, that it always seems like the loss that I've experienced in the many parts of my life, those losses have always seemed like blessings in the end, sort of. I mean, I know that seems odd, but because paradox is at the core of everything, the loss calls almost the trauma of the loss calls for the next blessing, or calls for the next thing that's going to happen, the next part of my life, that now as I look back, because it's a long ways back now, but I can see how, if a lot of people say this, if this one thing hadn't happened, then the next thing would never have come. It couldn't. Mm-hmm. It's like the one draws the next one into my life. As it leaves, it's like mm-hmm. pulling a wagon and the next thing is on there. So those are, but something I should also say is I don't know those things before I start. Mm-hmm. I don't know what I'm going to write about. I very often start with a line that comes to me in my sleep, and I have no idea where it's going. That happens even more in the novels.
When did you first start writing?
I didn't think that I could write decently until after I was in the convent, and I wrote a term paper on the Divine Comedy, and all of a sudden I realized that there was something bigger than what I'd been thinking about before to write about. And that's when I really first started. And then I started writing little essays but I didn't start thinking about writing as a book project or something very large until I was working on my doctoral degree and had to write a doctoral dissertation. And I had so much fun. I wanted to quit my job. I wanted to spend all my time just sitting at the typewriter, which is what we had then. This was back in 1980. And all I wanted to do was write. So that's what, and then that book, my doctoral thing, it got accepted for publication at Loyola University Press. And suddenly I knew that not only did I like to write, but I probably could.
And did you leave the convent before you went into this study program, or was it how long? I guess
the doctoral study?
Yes, and I guess I'm interested in how long you have so much life and passion in you, and I just wonder, and I know everybody else wonders, and this is kind of a personal question, but how long did you stay in the convent?
I stayed in the convent for 14 years. And then I was married to Pat Kelly for 10 years. And then I was married to John Weber for 23 years. And then I've been married to John Sack for 10 years.
And so is John Weber the John Weber of your early life?
From high school. Yeah, that's a really neat story.
They're all really neat stories. And so David asks, what was the subject of your dissertation?
The subject of my dissertation was let's see, how can I put? At the time, I worked as a chaplain at at Catholic Charities at a home for emotionally disturbed children and families, and I needed to know more about that. So I entered a doctoral program, which was a professional program. And my dissertation was how to work as a team, community, with these children who were in so much pain and so much suffering. And so the name of what I named my doctoral dissertation was When the Bough Breaks, because I wanted the symbolism of what happens when a family breaks and the children fall. And but what Loyola Press named it was Caring Community, because they wanted it to be a professional book that would go out to all the people who were called to be chaplains in institutions such as that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'd like to go back for a moment to the part of your talk about writing in your own voice. Because it's an interesting subject to me as an editor, because writing memoirs is entirely different than, well, and even as an editor for many of the books that I have worked on, there is a certain style, and it's the voice that, it may not be grammatically correct, but it's the voice. And so as an editor, I have to really kind of get out of the way of the story in order to really be a good editor. And in fact, when I'm first starting a book to edit, I read the whole thing before I ever touch a word, because that allows me to get inside that person and inside their voice and kind of wrap my arms around the big picture. And then the second time through, then I'm very careful about it. But I guess the question is, how far do you go with your voice? Is there a sort of place that you can feel really comfortable about whatever it is you have to say, whatever voice it is, whatever language it is, whether it's foul or funny or mean or hurtful, or how do you kind of manage that voice? And the other question, which is kind of part of the same thing, is, do you feel it's necessary when you're writing a memoir to, if you have something to say that was difficult about a person, do you tell that person that you've written about them?
Uh,
Two very different
Not
questions.
always. Not always. That's why I like Annie Lamott.
Yeah, right. Well, I
But,
guess that's why I asked, because really, you shouldn't really care, because they should have behaved better.
I have a very hard time with that. Like I said, I have a very hard time with in the book about Pat Kelly. I tell a situation which had been keeping a secret from everyone until I wrote that book. I felt, but it was my problem. I just didn't want anybody to know that. I didn't think, but it was so necessary to the book, and he's dead. And so I wrote that scene into the book with as much compassion as I could. And that's one of the things. I think that the key here is ego. That either as an editor or as a writer, if I think that you should write everything first that comes to you. You know, first of all, you should just lay it all out there. And then when you go back, before you even give it to an editor, I think you have to throw your ego away, and you have to look at that and say, did I write this because I want to be startling, or I want to be intense, or I want to show something really, really fantastic that happened to me, or even if it hurts somebody else in the telling? Those, I think that's what you throw away. And that's how you know. That's how you know, either as an editor or as a writer. I remember my first really big time editor with HarperCollins, when my book Woman Christ was being published there. And she said to me that it was she was the head of the editorial department for the religious part of Harper. And she said to me that it's really hard to train editors, new editors, young people. It's really hard to train them into giving up their own idea of how this book should sound, because they would like to write a book too, you know, and they would want it to sound like their voice. So it's very, very hard to teach people to do that. And that's the ego. So that's the thing that you have to give up, both as a writer and an editor, in going back and looking at the book.
Yeah,
and saying, how can I best bring this person's voice forward?
Yes, and also too that a memoir is not a place for you to bash people or to get your own rants spewed, or to argue a point. It's really telling a story and how it affected you and how you grow. And that's the bottom line to me. That's what makes a memoir different than an autobiography. It's about growing and little epiphanies and the things that opened your eyes. So I guess I think it is true, and I think that it's, if we write with compassion, yes, the truth might be kind of an irritant, but really no one gets hurt if you write from a totally compassionate point of view.
That's right. I believe that.
Yeah. So we have a couple of minutes left. Is there any final thing that you would like to say to anyone about writing or writing a memoir? Would you like me to repeat Anne Lamott's quote?
Yeah. I would like to say that I have begun to understand not only my own life, but the life of those people who have given me the great blessing of their love and their presence throughout my life, that I know us all better from having done this thing. I know us all better, and I'm so grateful for that. I'm so grateful.
Great.
I guess that's it. And
Yes.
I'd also like to say hello to my son, Jeff Weber, who I just saw his name down here.
Yes, great. Yes, that's exactly it, and beautiful. Tara asked me to please, yes, repeat the quote. The quote is, "Write your story. If people didn't want you to write about them, they should have behaved better." But I do think that there is, I love it too, but I also want to always say that if you're going to write, and you're going to write about other people, to do it compassionately and to write about your own growth and what you learned and what made you a better person.
I want to say one thing, may I? May I
Yes,
say one thing
please
about
do.
compassion?
Yes.
I think it's really important to tell the truth with compassion.
Yeah.
Not to make it sweet or something, or to leave out things that are important to the narrative, but to understand, if you can, how people came to do whatever it was that they did, that you want to be compassionate towards.
Yes.
And that's what gives you the compassion, is that you get it, you understand it.
Right. Because we're all just beings trying to do a good job, and we make a lot of mistakes and things happen.
We sure do. Mother Ann used to say, even a saint sins 7 times a day.
Thank you. That's fabulous. Thank you so much. I really love working with you, Christin, and I know everybody loves it when you're with me. So let's do it again. We will see you on July 9th, and we will be talking about memory and its truth and its lies in our heads. Thank you, Christin, and everyone have a really great weekend. Thank you so much.